Hello everyone, my name is Miguel Greenberg, and in this video I'm going to show you how to set up a Flask application on Visual Studio Code. Uh, you may remember that a little bit over a year ago I did a video in which I showed how to set up Flask on PyCharm. So a lot of people wanted the Visual Studio Code version of that. So this is what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to follow the same kind of structure that I did on the previous video. And you are welcome to look at that video, to contrast these two great options for Python IDEs. So let's begin. So like I did in the previous video, I'm going to use my Flasky example application. This is the application that is featured on my O'Reilly book on Flask. So I'm going to use that application to show you how to do a complete, thorough setup on Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to start by cloning the repository for this project, for Flasky. So clone and then the URL, which is github.com/Miguel Greenberg/Flasky. There we go. So I'm going to get into that directory, and the next step is to create a virtual environment for this project. And as I did with PyCharm, for Visual Studio Code, I also prefer to set up the virtual environment from the command line. I don't know why, but for me, it's a lot easier to do it, before I open the project. So that would be Python 3-m and then the name of the virtual environment is also going to be VM, which is what I always do. I should say that if you work with other tools that create virtual environments, pipem, poetry, any of those, it's totally fine, but you will need to know where the virtual environment is located. So keep that in mind. In this case, I have full control, and that's one of the benefits that I see in managing the virtual environment manually. I'm going to activate the environment, and the next step is to install the requirements for this project. So that is pip install, and for this project there are a few sets of requirements depending on the intended use of your installation. Since this is going to be for development, I'm going to do the dev.txt from the requirements folder. So there we go. Okay, great. So now we have the environment set up, and the next step is to configure the application to run. This application uses a database, and the database needs to be migrated and then initialized with some contents. And if you have the book, you already know this. To make that easy, I created a custom command, a custom Flask command that performs all these tasks in one step. So I'm going to configure my Flask application, which is called flasky.py. And this is a Flask requirement. You need to set up the Flask app environment variable, and then I can do Flask deploy. And this is a custom command that I was just telling you about. And this is going to run the database migrations, and then it's going to insert all the seed data that the application needs. So at this point, the application is ready to go. So I'm going to jump into Visual Studio Code, and from here I'm going to open the directory where I have all this code. So this is the directory where I cloned the repository. So there we go. Let's close the welcome window. And here it appears that Visual Studio Code doesn't realize this is a Python project initially. So what I always do is I just open a Python file, and that sorts of triggers the Python plugin, which by the way needs to be installed beforehand. It triggers it to initialize the Python subsystem. The first thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that you're using the correct Python interpreter for the project. And the correct interpreter in this case is the one that is in the virtual environment that I just created. You can see down here that I can select an interpreter and I get a lot of options. But if you look at the one that's highlighted as current, that's already the correct one. So Visual Studio Code recognized that there was a virtual environment, and then it selected the Python 3 interpreter from that directory. So this is all ready to go. So the next step is to configure the or to create a run configuration. We need to tell code how this application runs. So to do that, I'm going to go into the debugger tab, which shows a list of configurations, which is right now empty. So I'm going to say add configuration, and here I get a list of options, and very conveniently there is one for Flask. So I select Flask, and now I get sort of a prompt to specify some information about the application. And now it wants me to provide the name of the Flask application, which is the top level file where the application instance is. And this is the same thing that I set in the Flask app environment variable. So flasky.py. And now it creates the run configuration, which is a JSON file. So this is called launch JSON, and it's written somewhere within the project. I believe it's right. So it creates a VS Code, a .vs Code directory, and then inside it writes config files. And this is convenient because then you can add all these files, all the code configurations to your Git repository, and then they'll be preserved. So this configuration is actually pretty good, and I believe I don't have anything else to do. I think I can go to in the debug menu, start without debugging. I think should start the application. Yep. So now the application is running. So this was actually pretty easy, a little bit easier than PyCharm. So just to make sure that this is working, let's go to a browser, and there we go. So this is the application. I can go to the login page and so on. So, first step done. This is looking great. Let's go back. Here I can stop the application from this little toolbar that pops up while it's running, and you can see that the terminal where the application runs, it's actually a real terminal. This is configured exactly like my normal terminal. It picks up everything. So this looks like my normal terminal, which is actually nice. So I believe the second thing that I showed for PyCharm was how to run with debugger. So under the debugger. So let's do that next. Just to verify that the debugger is working, I'm just going to pick, let's say, no, let's go to the login. Let's close this a little bit. So this is the login view. So let's put a breakpoint right before we validate the login form, let's say. So now I can either do it from here, start debugging, or I can also do it from here with the green arrow. Either way, they do the same thing. And there we go. So we're running under the debugger now. So now let's do the same thing. So let's go to the home page. This one doesn't have any breakpoints, so it runs just fine. As soon as I hit login, I am thrown into the debugger right at the breakpoint location. And here I can check variables. You can see this is the form object. We have where are the fields? So this is a field, for example, one of them. Now in this case, this is the get request. So we are not we're not ready to validate the form. So this is going to not validate, and that will trigger the form to render. So if I do with the buttons that I have here, I can navigate. So I can do next instruction without getting inside the code. This is next instruction, but jumping into a function. And this one is to step out of the current function. So let's do this one. Of course, this is false, and that triggers the template to render. So we can now let the debugger continue, and now we have the form. So this is working good. So this was step 2, how to set up the debugger. I'm going to clear the breakpoint and stop this. I believe what I did next was to set up the unit tests. So let's do that here. So unfortunately, when you open a new project, there's nothing in the user interface that suggests that you can add tests. But that is an unfortunate side effect of how the UI is designed. There is actually full support in code for running tests. So what I'm going to do is to open this thing that code calls the command palette, which on the Mac is Command-Shift-P. This is a very convenient way to access a lot of functions for the editor without having to go into the menus or clicking with the mouse. You can see that right here, and probably because I use this on many of my projects, so it may not be the same for you, but I have Python Discover tests at the top. So if you don't see it when you do this, you can type anything, and then the bar works as a search. So eventually, if you type test or tests, you will find this Discover tests option. So we click there, and we get asked if we want to enable unit testing and configure it, which of course it's a yes. So we click, and we get another guided prompt here, and in this case, code supports, or the Python extension for code supports 3 different test runners: unit test, PyTest, and nose. So I'm gonna go with unit test, which is the one that I used when you run this test suite from the command line. So just to be consistent with that, I'll go with unit test. Now it wants to know what directory my tests are located. So these are in the tests directory. And then it wants to know the file pattern that it should use to recognize or to discover all the files that have tests in them. And I think many of these will work. The format that I've used is test underscore something in this project. But I think the one that covers pretty much every possible case is the bottom one, which is star test star. So I'm going to go with that one. So now it's going to spend a couple seconds discovering tests, and then at some point a new section appeared on the UI. So now we do have UI support for tests, and here you can see these are all the modules, And then inside you can see the test case and the actual tests that were recognized for this application. So I can run the tests, and it's pretty easy. This will take a few seconds, and we'll see if we get a full pass. There we go. So all the tests passed. Just to make sure that this is all working, we can let's take this one test and just change something to force it to fail, and then let's rerun everything and see if it finds that one test as a failure. And you can see how those look in the UI. There we go. So you can see this is the failure. So for any test, you can double click it, and then it finds that test in the code, which is actually very convenient. All the tests have these floating little buttons. So if you want to run a standalone test, you can just click there and it runs. You can also run it from this left side panel. And another thing you can do, if you put a breakpoint here, then you can run the test under the debugger. So then it will stop there, and you can check things and debug your test. Let's let it finish. And what else? Then let's fix that once again and run that one more time to get it back to green. So I think this is pretty much all that I did on PyCharm. So now you can compare these two. So now that tests are set up, I need to show you, like I did in the previous video, one thing that specific to the debugger that does not work well, and this is due to a bug, a long time bug in Flask. So let's see, how can we do this? When you run your application and anything crashes, if you're running in debug mode, you get the debugger on the web browser, right? And you get the exception, and you can debug it. Since now we want to use the code debugger, what we would like to do is that instead of getting the Flask in-browser debugger, instead we would like the crash to be reported in the code debugger, and that's actually what's broken, and it's been broken for ages, for a very long time in Flask. So let's see. Let's go to the code. So for example, let's go back to that login. So here, let's put some broken code here just for fun. So let's result equals a divided by 2, right? So this is going to be an error because a is not defined. So let's go ahead and run this with the debugger. Very good. It's running. And now here, if we go to the login, we get the internal server error, and you can see that the error is reported in the terminal as it should, but the debugger did not get it. So this is a bug, and to address this bug and make this work, basically what we need to do is we need to switch from using the Flask run command, which is which is what we have here in this Flask configuration that was built, that I built initially. This is calling Flask, and then it passes run as an argument. So Flask run does not properly tell an external debugger that there's been an error. So what we need to do is we need to switch to the old way of running Flask applications, which is by using the app.run function. So in flasky.py, I'm going to go to the bottom, and I'm going to add the very familiar block of app run code. So this is going to make this flasky.py an executable module that will start the application when it's run from code. So we need to configure a few things. We don't want to use the debugger. This means we are disabling the Flask debugger because we're going to use the code debugger. So the Flask debugger needs to be off. We need to disable the reloader as well, because that interferes with code. So you should never use the reloader when you run the application through code or PyCharm. And then finally, there's one more setting that is this setting that corrects the bug that unfortunately cannot be issued from Flask run, and also unfortunately I don't remember exactly the name. So I guess I can use this opportunity to show you how good code is to navigate dependencies. So I need to look for a third argument. So I'm going to go into app.run. So this found the run method within Flask. And here near the bottom it calls run simple. And run simple is the function that actually runs the internal function in Werkzeug that runs the web server. So I'm going to jump into that function, and this is the argument that I need. Pass-through errors needs to be set to true for errors to bubble up into an external debugger. So, okay. So let's set that to true. Great. So now we can run this again. There we go. And here, let's go back to the home page. And from here, I'm going to click login. Something's missing. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, of course something's missing. Let me stop this. Yeah. So I forgot to change launch JSON to not do Flask run. It needs to run Flasky. So the module that we're going to run now is Flasky. There are no arguments. Flasky at this point doesn't take any arguments. So 0 arguments. And the environment variables are not used, but they don't hurt anything, so I'll leave them there. So let's try one more time. It's running. So now back to the home page. I'm going to click on login, and there we go. Now when there's a crash, I get thrown into the code debugger. Now keep in mind that I'm not telling you that you need to switch to use the old app.run for everything. This is only when you're running the code project. So from code, you should do it this way. If you're running from the CLI, there's no problem. You can run it in the way that you like. You can keep using Flask run. Nothing that we're doing here is preventing the original, the Flask run mechanism from running in other situations. So basically, you should only do it for code so that you can get the crashes properly reported into the debugger. So I believe I've done everything. This is now a fairly complete and robust, in my opinion, setup for the Flask application. And as I said before, if you want to compare and decide if you like code or PyCharm, then look at the previous video that I did more than a year ago on the same topic for PyCharm Community Edition. So anyway, I hope this is useful, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment and let me know. Thank you. Bye bye.